A severed gold chain hissed as it slid off the gurney, landing in a pool of dark arterial blood on the sterile tile. The men in black suits ignored it, their shoulders forming a wall of expensive wool in desperation as they shoved the bed into the trauma bay. The man on the mattress didn't gasp for air or beg for a priest. He simply fixed his dark, predatory eyes on the woman in blue, his silence more terrifying than a scream. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a command to defy death. The rhythmic, mechanical chirp of the vitals monitors was the only heartbeat Miami General had left at 2:47 a.m. For Elena Carter, the sound was a lullaby she'd been hearing for the last 12 hours of a brutal double shift. Standing at the central station with a chart in one hand and a cold caffeine hit in the other, she looked every bit the unremarkable professional. 27, dressed in standard-issue navy scrubs, her brown hair yanked into a practical, messy bun that favored function over form. She had spent 6 years building this version of herself, the one who was calm, unbuyable, and entirely invisible. She thought she had successfully buried the woman who knew how to survive a jungle ambush under the weight of hospital protocols and student loans. Then the ambulance bay doors hissed open, the humid Florida night rushed in, and the carefully constructed silence of her new life was torn apart. The heavy glass doors didn't just open, they were forced. Four black SUVs sat idling on the ramp, their headlights extinguished, looking like predators waiting in the dark. 6 men moved in a tight formation, their suits sharp and out of place against the pale hospital walls. They didn't wait for a triage nurse. They surged into the trauma bay, carrying a man whose white silk shirt was now a map of dark, spreading stains. Dr. Aris, the attending physician, took one look at the holsters peeking from under the men's jackets, and suddenly remembered a phone call he had to take in the back office. The room cleared of everyone who had a choice to leave. Elena Carter did not move. She didn't look at the guns or the stone-faced giants blocking the exits. She looked at the man on the gurney. His skin was the color of ash, and his breathing was shallow, the ragged, uneven sound of a body beginning to quit. Trauma room 3. Now, Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the low murmurs of the men. One of the bodyguards, a man with a jagged scar across his knuckles, stepped into her path. You know who this is? I know he has 4 minutes before his lungs collapse, Elena replied, her hands already snapping on a pair of latex gloves. She didn't wait for his permission. She pushed past him, her shoulder clipping his arm, and grabbed the head of the gurney. Move. For the next 40 minutes, the world narrowed down to the size of a surgical tray. Elena worked with a terrifying, silent precision. While the monitors shrieked and the bodyguards paced like caged wolves, she remained the only still point in the room. She bypassed the standard wait for a surgeon, her fingers moving with a muscle memory that felt older than her 6 years at the hospital. She cleaned the entry wounds, her touch firm and clinical, refusing to let her hands shake even when she felt the weight of 5 different stares tracking her every move. The silence in the room changed. It went from the heavy tension of a fuse burning down to something cold and expectant. The monitors slowed their frantic pacing. The sharp, rhythmic beat of a stabilized heart began to fill the space. Lorenzo Vieri opened his eyes. He didn't gasp. He didn't ask where he was. He lay perfectly still, his gaze traveling upward until it locked onto Elena. She was leaning over him, documenting the placement of the stitches on his chest. She noticed the way his pupils didn't dilate. He was fully present, calculating the room in a single heartbeat. She felt the heat of his stare on the side of her face, but she didn't look up from her clipboard. She simply reached over, adjusted the flow of his foredrip, and noted the time. The police will be here in 10 minutes, she said quietly, speaking to the room, but looking only at her charts. If you're leaving, you should do it in 5. She finally looked at him then. Lorenzo didn't thank her. He didn't smile. He simply watched her with a dark, heavy intensity, as if he were memorizing the exact shade of her eyes. In that look, the pressure shifted. Elena realized she hadn't just saved a life. She had caught the attention of a man who never forgot a face. The Vieri compound sat on the edge of Biscayne Bay like a fortress of glass and cold stone. At 4 in the morning, the only sound was the rhythmic slap of the tide against the private pier. Inside the master suite, the air was chilled by industrial-grade cooling, but Lorenzo didn't feel the cold. He sat upright in a leather armchair, a glass of deep red Barolo sitting on the side table. The wine remained untouched, the surface as still as a mirror. Across from him, Dr. Aris had been replaced by a man flown in on a private jet from New York. Dr. Marcello was a man who had patched up soldiers in 3 different wars and senators in 2 different countries. He worked in silence, his fingers tracing the line of sutures across Lorenzo's chest. The doctor stepped back, dropping a blood-stained gauze into a bin. He didn't look at Lorenzo's face. He looked at the stitches. "The technique is unusual," Marcello said, his voice dry. "Very fast. Very aggressive. It's the kind of work you see in a field hospital when the building is falling down around you. Whoever did this didn't just save you. They did it with a level of skill that shouldn't exist in a public ER." Lorenzo didn't respond. He was looking at the ceiling, but he wasn't seeing the crown molding. He was seeing a pair of focused, steady eyes and a name tag that read Elena. He remembered the way she hadn't flinched when the guns were drawn. Most people in Miami looked at him and saw a checkbook or a coffin. She had looked at him and seen a problem to be solved. He reached out and rang a small silver bell. A moment later, the heavy oak door opened. Victor Russo stepped inside. Victor was the kind of man who existed in the shadows behind the throne, quiet, efficient, and deeply suspicious of anything he couldn't control. "The doctor is finished," Lorenzo said, his voice a low rasp. Victor glanced at Marcello, who quickly packed his bag and retreated from the room. Once the door clicked shut, the silence returned, heavier than before. "The police are asking questions at Miami General," Victor reported. "We've handled the surveillance footage. As far as the city is concerned, you were never there." Lorenzo finally picked up the wine glass, but he didn't drink. He rotated it slowly, watching the light catch the liquid. "The nurse." Victor tightened his jaw. "She's a civilian, Lorenzo. A nobody with a clean file. Bringing her into our orbit creates a trail we don't need right now. The Colombians are already watching the docks. We need to stay invisible." Lorenzo set the glass back down with a sharp clack against the marble. The sound was small, but Victor stopped talking immediately. Lorenzo looked at his second-in-command, his expression unreadable. "Find her," Lorenzo said. Victor opened his mouth to argue, saw the stillness in Lorenzo's posture, and closed it again. He nodded once and backed out of the room. Lorenzo leaned his head back and closed his eyes. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the war on the docks. He was thinking about a woman who wore blue scrubs like armor. He wanted to know why an ordinary nurse had the hands of a combat medic. By noon the following day, the sun was a blinding white glare over the Atlantic, but inside Victor's office, the blinds were drawn tight. On his desk sat a manila folder, thin and unremarkable. Victor had spent 6 hours watching his digital team strip away the layers of a life, and the result was bothering him. He walked into Lorenzo's study and laid the folder down. "Elena Carter," Victor said. "Age 27. 6 years at Miami General. She lives in a 1-bedroom in Wynwood and pays her rent 3 days early every month. 1 student loan nearly paid off. No social media. No family listed on her emergency contact forms." Lorenzo didn't look up from the folder. He flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning her high school transcripts and nursing license. Everything was perfect. Too perfect. "There's no record of her before age 21, Victor added, his voice dropping an octave. "No childhood photos in the cloud, no old bank accounts. It's a clean slate. It looks like a life that started in a witness box, but there's no federal flag on her social security number." Victor felt the familiar itch at the back of his neck. He knew what a cleaned life looked like. He had seen professionals do it for a price, but Elena Carter didn't have the money for that kind of ghosting. He chose not to mention the itch yet. Lorenzo was already staring at the photocopied ID picture of the nurse, his thumb tracing the edge of the paper. Across the city, the humidity was thick enough to taste. Elena unlocked the door to her apartment, the click of the deadbolt sounding louder than usual in the empty hallway. She didn't turn on the lights. She walked straight to the kitchen, her movements heavy with the kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. She poured a glass of water and stood by the sink, watching the shadows of the palm trees dance against her kitchen tile. Her hands were steady, but as she took a sip, she noticed a small, dark smudge of dried blood under her thumbnail that the hospital soap had missed. She didn't scrub it away immediately. She just stared at it. For 6 years, she had been a ghost. She had worked the night shifts because ghosts are harder to see in the dark. She had chosen Miami General because it was too busy for anyone to ask personal questions. But the way that man had looked at her on the gurney, not with fear, but with recognition, felt like a crack in the foundation she had built. "Just another shift," she whispered to the empty room. She rinsed the glass, dried it, and placed it perfectly back in the cupboard. She told herself that a man like that wouldn't go looking for a nurse. She told herself she was still invisible. She almost believed it, until she noticed a black SUV she didn't recognize parked at the end of her street, idling in the heat. The electronic beep of Elena's ID badge felt louder than usual when she clocked in 3 days later. She expected the familiar chaos of the ER, the smell of antiseptic, the distant ring of phones, the rush of the morning shift change. Instead, she found the charge nurse looking at her with a strange, pinched expression. "Director's office, Elena," the nurse said, nodding toward the elevators. Now, the top floor of Miami General was a different world. The floors were carpeted, muffling the sound of footsteps, and the air smelled of expensive lilies rather than bleach. Elena was led into a corner office where the director of operations sat behind a desk made of dark, polished mahogany. He didn't look like a man about to deliver a reprimand. He looked like a man who had just won the lottery. "Sit down, Elena," he said, gesturing to a soft leather chair. He didn't look her in the eye. Instead, he stared at a thick folder on his desk. "An anonymous donor has made a very significant contribution to our trauma wing. 7 figures. It's enough to renovate the entire floor." Elena didn't sit. She stood with her hands hidden in her scrub pockets, her fingers curling into tight fists. "And what does that have to do with me?" The director pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk. "The donor was very specific. They were impressed by your work. They want to retain your services as a private medical liaison. Full salary plus a signing bonus that would—" He paused, finally looking up. "Well, it would pay off your student loans and your lease 10 times over by Christmas." Elena's gaze dropped to the paper. The numbers were staggering, but it was the language of the contract that chilled her. It wasn't an employment agreement, it was a bill of sale. It required her to be on call 24 hours a day. It required her to relocate. It required her silence. She didn't read the second page. She slid the paper back toward him with a slow, steady motion. "Who sent this?" she asked. The director cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. "The donation came through a private trust. The names are confidential. But Elena, look at those numbers. You'd never have to work a double shift again." Elena looked at the director's hands. They were shaking slightly. He wasn't offering her a promotion. He was delivering a message from a man who didn't take no for an answer. The hospital was no longer her sanctuary. The walls she had built were being dismantled by a checkbook. "I need to think about it," Elena said. It was a lie, but her voice was calm. She saw the director relax, his shoulders dropping an inch. He thought she was tempted. He thought everyone had a price. Elena turned and walked out of the office. She didn't go back to the nursing station. She went to the locker room, grabbed her car keys, and walked straight out the front doors. She knew the location of the Vieri compound wasn't in the phone book, but she also knew that a man who sends a 7-figure contract doesn't want to be hard to find. He was waiting for her to sign. She was going to show him exactly what her silence cost. Elena didn't go home to change. She drove across the city in her blue scrubs, the hospital ID still clipped to her chest like a shield. She didn't need a map. The address of the Vieri compound had lived in the back of her mind since the moment Lorenzo had arrived at the ER. She pulled her modest sedan up to the towering iron gates and lowered her window. A guard with an earpiece stepped out, his hand resting near his hip. Elena didn't wait for him to speak. "Tell Lorenzo Vieri that the woman from room 3 is here," she said. Her voice was flat, carrying the authority of a woman who had spent years giving orders in a crisis. The guard hesitated, searched her face, and then tapped his radio. A moment later, the gate swung open with a heavy mechanical groan. The main house was a monument to glass and silence. As Elena stepped into the marble entrance hall, her sneakers squeaked against the floor, a small, human sound in a place that felt like a museum. Victor Russo was already there, blocking the path to the inner rooms. He looked at her with a cold, narrow-eyed suspicion. "You're supposed to sign the contract at the hospital, Miss Carter," Victor said, his voice like grinding gravel. "You weren't invited here." "I don't sign things I haven't declined in person," Elena replied. She took a step forward, not stopping until she was inches from him. "Get out of my way." Victor didn't move. He stood like a wall of dark wool, his shadow stretching over her. The tension in the hall was a physical weight, but Elena didn't blink. "Let her through, Victor." The voice came from the room beyond, low, calm, and unmistakable. Victor stepped aside with a stiff, reluctant nod. Elena walked into a wide study. One wall was nothing but glass, offering a panoramic view of the gray-blue waters of Biscayne Bay. Lorenzo stood by the window, his back to her. He had traded his ruined shirt for a black sweater that hid the bandages, but his posture was still rigid. "The donation was a nice touch," Elena said to his back. "It bought the hospital's silence. But if you think a few $1,000,000 and a fancy contract can buy mine, you've miscalculated." Lorenzo turned slowly. He didn't look angry. He looked fascinated. "It wasn't just a donation, Elena. It was an exit. Most people in your position would be looking for a way out of the double shifts." "I don't need a way out," she snapped. "And I don't belong to you. Keep your money and stay out of my hospital." Lorenzo watched her, his gaze settling on the way she stood, balanced, ready, and completely unafraid. He took a single step toward her, and for a second, the corners of his mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. Then the world turned white. The glass wall behind Lorenzo didn't shatter. It vibrated with a deafening, bone-shaking thud. A flash of brilliant heat erupted from the floor below, followed by a roar that swallowed the air in the room. The floor buckled, and the smell of ozone and burning plastic rushed in. Lorenzo didn't duck. He lunged across the space, grabbing Elena by the arm just as the secondary blast blew the doors off their hinges. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed, the only sound was the distant, rising wail of a security siren. The siege had begun. The white light vanished, replaced by a suffocating darkness. Then the emergency power kicked in. The room was bathed in a rhythmic, pulsing red that turned the dust in the air into a thick mist. Downstairs, the heavy rattle of automatic gunfire started, muffled by the reinforced floors, but vibrating through the soles of Elena's shoes. Victor was already on the move. He pressed a hand to his ear, screaming coordinates into a radio that crackled with static. "Sector 4 is gone. They're inside the lobby. Seal the elevators." Lorenzo didn't waste time with words. He grabbed Elena's shoulder and pulled her behind a thick concrete column, just as a spray of bullets shattered the remaining glass ornaments on the desk. He reached into the small of his back, drew a sleek, black semi-automatic, and pressed it into Elena's hand. It was a reflex, the action of a man who assumed everyone around him was helpless. But as his hand let go, he froze. Elena's fingers didn't tremble. Her hand wrapped around the grip with a practiced, instinctive ease. Her thumb immediately found the safety, flicking it off without her even looking at the weapon. She held it low, her finger resting straight along the frame, exactly where it belonged. She wasn't holding a foreign object. She was holding a tool she had used 1,000 times. Lorenzo stared at her hand, then at her face. The shock in his eyes lasted only a second, replaced by a grim, new understanding. He realized in that moment that he hadn't brought a victim into his home. "The secure room is 2 floors down," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal calm. "The stairs are compromised. We use the service shaft." Elena nodded once. She didn't ask how to shoot or where to go. She simply stepped into line behind him, her eyes scanning the shadows of the hallway with a tactical focus that had nothing to do with nursing. They moved through the pulsing red light. The air was getting hotter, smelling of scorched copper and smoke. As they reached the stairwell, Elena stopped and pulled Lorenzo back by his belt just as a shadow flickered on the wall ahead. She didn't speak, she just pointed at the floor. 3 small, blinking red lights sat near the baseboard. Motion sensors. Lorenzo looked at the sensors, then back at the nurse in the blue scrubs. He realized then that the clean file Victor had found wasn't just a mystery. It was a masterpiece. Elena Carter wasn't hiding from a life she hated. She was hiding a set of skills that made her the most dangerous person in the building. He didn't ask her who she was. He just followed her lead as she stepped over the beams. For the first time, Lorenzo Vieri wasn't the one in charge of the rescue. He was just trying to keep up. The steel door of the safe room hissed shut, sealing out the roar of the fire and the stutter of gunfire. The silence inside was heavy, smelling of ozone and recycled air. Lorenzo leaned against a console, his hand pressed against the fresh bandage on his chest, while a wall of monitors flickered to life. The screens showed grainy, green-tinted views of the hallways. 6-man teams moved in perfect synchronization, ghosting through the smoke. They didn't check corners like police. They moved in a fluid, diamond-shaped sweep that prioritized total elimination over arrest. "Anvil and blade," Elena said quietly. Lorenzo's head snapped toward her. "What?" "The formation," she said, her eyes locked on the secondary monitor. She stepped past him, her fingers flying across the touch screen to pull up a wider angle of the north perimeter. "They aren't just looking for you. They're neutralizing the camera dead zones in a 3-second sequence. You only know that sequence if you've seen the hardwired layout of this building." She pointed to the screen where a camera feed suddenly cut to static. "Someone gave them the floor plan. And I know exactly how they move because I was trained by the same people who trained them." The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the room. Lorenzo didn't reach for his gun. He didn't even move. He just watched her, really watched her, as she stood there in her blood-stained blue scrubs, looking at a tactical map like it was a patient's chart. "I wasn't always a nurse," she said, her voice steady and hollow. "Before I was Elena Carter, I was a field medic for a cartel in the Colombian highlands. I spent 4 years patching up men who did exactly what those men outside are doing. I didn't leave because I was tired of the blood. I left because I was tired of being the only one who cared that it was spilling." She turned to face him, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in her dark eyes. "I burned my life to the ground to become someone unremarkable, someone safe. But I know that tactical rhythm. It's not Italian. It's a private security firm out of Bogota." Lorenzo didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for proof. He stood perfectly still, absorbing the fact that the woman who had saved him was a ghost of the very world he inhabited. For a man who lived by controlling information, finding a secret this large in his own home was a physical blow. He looked at the monitors, then back at the door they had just come through. His voice was a cold, dangerous whisper when he finally spoke. "Victor built this compound's security architecture," Lorenzo said. "He's the only one with the encryption keys to the camera sequence." The realization hung between them. The betrayal wasn't coming from the outside. It was already in the room. In that moment, the alliance shifted. Lorenzo wasn't just looking at a nurse who knew too much. He was looking at the only person he could actually trust. The digital clock on the secure room's wall counted down the seconds. Outside, the muffled thud-thud-thud of kinetic britching tools vibrated through the reinforced steel. Elena didn't look at the clock. She checked the weight of the weapon in her hand, then looked at Lorenzo. They didn't need a plan. The air in the room had changed from a rescue to an ambush. Lorenzo moved to the right of the frame, his shadow merging with the equipment racks. Elena took the left, sinking into a low crouch behind a server bank. In her blue scrubs, she looked like a ghost in a machine. The door didn't just open, it disintegrated. A flashbang detonated, filling the small space with white light and a roar that would have paralyzed a civilian. But Elena's eyes were already shut, her jaw open to protect her eardrums. When she opened them a second later, the first two men were through the threshold. The room erupted in a short, surgical burst of violence. Elena moved with a terrifying economy of motion. She didn't fire wildly. She waited for the gaps in their body armor, her movements fluid and cold. To her right, Lorenzo was a blur of lethal precision. It was over in 12 seconds. The smoke from the door charge hadn't even reached the ceiling before the breach team was down. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, slow and heavy. Victor Russo stepped through the ruined doorway, a weapon in his hand, but he stopped when he saw the bodies of the men he had hired. He looked at Lorenzo, then his gaze shifted to Elena. He saw the way she held her weapon. He saw the lack of sweat on her brow. In a single motion, Lorenzo was on him. He didn't fire. He slammed Victor against the stone wall of the corridor, his hand crushing the man's throat. Victor's gun clattered to the floor, forgotten. Elena stood 3 feet away, her weapon lowered but ready. She watched Victor's face. She didn't look for anger or fear. She looked for the slight twitch in his left eye, the way his gaze flickered toward the exit. She saw the moment he realized his clean nurse was the reason his team was dead. "The Colombians offered you a percentage of the docks," Lorenzo hissed, his voice like a blade. "But they couldn't have given you the codes. Who really opened the door, Victor?" Victor struggled for air, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. He looked at Elena, seeing the ghost of the woman she used to be. He realized he had miscalculated more than just a security code. He had ignored the only person in the room who truly knew how his world worked. "It wasn't the docks," Victor wheezed, his eyes bulging. "They have your brother, Lorenzo. They've had him for a week." The hand at Victor's throat tightened, then went unnervingly still. Lorenzo didn't look at Victor anymore. He looked at Elena. The betrayal had a new face, and the war they were fighting had just become a rescue mission neither of them was prepared for. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the smoke-filled sky into a bruise of purple and gold. The fire in the lower levels had been contained, leaving the east wing smelling of salt air and wet ash. Lorenzo sat on a low stone wall in the courtyard, his silhouette sharp against the rising light. Elena sat beside him. She didn't ask for permission, and he didn't offer a seat. They simply existed in the same space because the distance between a nurse and a patient had been burned away. She looked down at her blue scrubs. They were ruined, torn at the shoulder and dark with a mixture of hospital antiseptic and the night's violence. Lorenzo didn't ask why she had hidden her past. He didn't ask how she had forged a life out of thin air. He understood the art of the mask better than anyone. He had built an empire by being exactly what people expected to see, a monster to his enemies, a king to his men, while keeping the man underneath under lock and key. "Marcelo was right about the stitches," Lorenzo said, his voice barely louder than the tide. "He said they were done by someone who knew what it was like when the world was ending." He turned his head to look at her. The predatory edge in his eyes had softened into something else, a quiet, dangerous respect. "The woman who kept me breathing in that ER and the woman who held the line in that hallway. They aren't two different people, Elena. You just let me see the rest of you." Elena watched a lone seagull circle the blackened pier. For 6 years, she had been Elena Carter. She had been the girl who paid her rent early and never raised her voice. She had been safe. But as the sun warmed her skin, she realized that the safe girl was a ghost. Elena Carter was a story she had told herself so she could sleep at night, but it was the other woman, the one who knew the weight of a gun and the rhythm of an ambush, who had kept them both alive. "I'm not sure I can go back to the hospital," she said. It wasn't a lament, it was a cold realization. "You can't," Lorenzo agreed. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, encrypted mobile phone, sliding it across the stone toward her. "Victor is gone, but the men who paid him are still out there. My brother is still out there. And the feds have been watching this house for 2 years. They'll be looking for a nurse." Elena looked at the phone but didn't pick it up yet. By taking it, she wasn't just accepting a job. She was stepping back into the fire she had spent a decade running from. Lorenzo stood up, his movements stiff but steady. He looked down at her one last time. The woman who had walked through his doors in blue scrubs at 2:47 in the morning and changed the math of his entire life. He didn't offer her a contract this time. He offered her a seat at a table where she wouldn't have to hide. Elena reached out and took the phone. The unremarkable nurse was dead. As she stood to join him, she knew the war was just beginning, but for the first time in 6 years, she wasn't interested in being invisible. She was interested in being seen.